The station floated above Verith Prime like a metal moon. It was massive, bigger than any city on Earth, and it had been built 4,000 years ago by species that humans had not even known existed until 3 decades back. Its name was the Galactic Conclave, and inside it sat the most powerful political body in the known galaxy, the Interstellar Assembly. Colonel Nathan Hale had been inside the conclave for 2 days, and he already hated it. Not because it was ugly. It was actually beautiful in a cold, alien sort of way. Tall ceilings made of pale mineral glass, corridors that hummed with a low, steady vibration. Delegates from 100 different worlds walking past in robes and armor and things that had no human word for them. No, Nathan didn't hate the place because of how it looked. He hated it because of how it felt. Like a room where the verdict had already been written, and everyone was just waiting for the reading. He walked beside Ambassador Diane Cole through the long corridor that led to the main chamber. Diane was calm. She was always calm. She had short dark hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of face that gave nothing away. She had spent 11 years as Earth's chief diplomatic voice in this assembly, and in that time she had learned one important thing. Most species in this galaxy talk too much and listen too little. "They've been at it since before we arrived," said Lieutenant Commander Danny Reeves, falling into step behind them. He was young, 26, and still had the habit of saying things out loud that older officers kept to themselves. 6 different delegations have already submitted formal grievance filings. 6, before the session even opened. "I know," said Diane. "The hegemony coordinated it," Danny added. No way 6 species all independently decided to file grievances in the same 48-hour window. "I know that too," said Diane. Nathan said nothing. He looked straight ahead. They entered the main chamber. It was a wide circular room with tiered seating arranged around a central floor of dark stone. Every seat was filled. The air smelled faintly of something sweet and chemical. The Iraqi always released a calming compound into shared spaces, a habit of theirs that humans found quietly insulting. The human delegation took their seats in the outer ring, where newer member species were placed. 31 years in the assembly, and Earth was still in the outer ring. The session was called to order by Delegate Vreth of the Iraqi Dominion. He was ancient, no one knew exactly how old, and he had the slow, deliberate movements of something that had never in its life felt rushed. His scales were pale, and his eyes were a deep amber color. He looked at the human delegation the way a man looks at a small stain on an otherwise clean floor. "This emergency session," Vreth began, in the Assembly's common trade language, "has been convened to address a matter of serious concern to multiple member states. The Evoran hegemony has formally submitted a resolution calling for immediate human withdrawal from all settlements in the Kepler Fringe Corridor." There it was. The Kepler Fringe was a stretch of star systems, roughly 40 light-years from Earth's established territory. 40 years ago, it had been surveyed and listed as unclaimed. No species lived there. No species had built there. The ruins of some ancient civilization dotted a few of the rocky worlds, but whoever had built those ruins was long gone. 20 years ago, Earth had sent scout ships. 15 years ago, the first settlers had arrived. 10 years ago, there were 12 functioning colonies, 3 mining operations, and a small orbital repair station. Nobody had said a word. Until now. Delegate Vreth read the charges in his slow, theatrical voice. Unauthorized territorial expansion, violation of galactic buffer zones, cultural disruption, exploitation of uncertified resource fields. It went on and on. The chamber filled with the sounds of other delegates nodding, clicking, humming, whatever their species did to signal agreement. Diane sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and listened to every word. The representative from the Evoran hegemony, a tall, thin creature named Doss, with 4 arms and a translator chip humming at its throat, stood and outlined the terms of their resolution. Humanity would vacate all Kepler fringe settlements within one galactic cycle. All structures would be dismantled or surrendered. Earth would pay reparations for unauthorized resource extraction. And until those terms were met, a full trade embargo would be placed on all human shipping lanes. A trade embargo. That meant no medical imports from Iraqi suppliers, no fuel compounds from Marathi refineries, no navigational data from hegemony relay stations. Earth could survive it. Humans were stubborn about survival. But it would hurt. It was meant to hurt. That was the point. 6 hours passed. Species after species stood and gave statements. Some were long, some were dramatic. One delegation spent 40 minutes describing, in careful detail, how human expansion had supposedly disrupted a migration route used by a species of space-dwelling organisms that no one had documented before that exact moment. Danny leaned over to Nathan and whispered, "They made that up." Nathan's expression didn't change. He was watching the chamber the way he used to watch the hills back home during training exercises. Not looking at any one thing, but watching everything at once. Near the end of the 6th hour, he leaned slightly toward Diane and said quietly, "They've already decided." She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She just looked straight ahead at the chamber floor and said, "Then let them hear us first." The session was recessed for the night cycle. The human delegation walked back through the pale-lit corridors in near silence. Some of the other delegations watched them pass. A few looked away. One young Marathi delegate, small, gray, nervous-eyed, held Nathan's gaze for just a moment before dropping it. Nathan noticed. He filed it away. Back in their quarters, Danny pulled up data on his screen and started cross-referencing charter documents. Dr. Laura Finch, Earth's scientific advisor, was already at the table when they arrived, surrounded by projected files and survey maps. She had been preparing since before they left Earth. She hadn't slept in 2 days. "How bad was it?" she asked without looking up. "About what we expected," said Diane. "Worse," said Nathan. Diane looked at him. He almost never corrected her. "They brought in 6 species we didn't anticipate," he said. "The hegemony has been working on this for a long time." Laura nodded slowly, still staring at her files. "Then we make sure tomorrow is longer than today." Outside the station's hull, the stars were cold and still. Somewhere in the dark, 12 colonies on 12 worlds in the Kepler fringe were going about their ordinary lives. Children sleeping, miners finishing shifts, families eating dinner under alien skies. They didn't know what was being decided about them. That thought sat in Nathan's chest like a stone. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark and stared at the stars. And he thought about what it meant to be a species that had only just arrived, and how the galaxy had already decided what to do with them. He thought about it for a long time. Then he stopped thinking about it and started planning. The second morning came with no sun. The conclave station had no windows in the session halls. Only artificial light that shifted slowly from deep blue to pale white to tell the residents what time it was. When the light turned white, the delegates began filling the chamber again. Nathan Hale arrived early. He sat in the human delegation section of the outer ring and watched the other delegates take their seats. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, real coffee, brought from Earth in a sealed container, because the station's food processors made something brown and hot that tasted like burnt cardboard and disappointment. He drank slowly and watched the room fill. Delegate Vreth entered last, as he always did. He moved to the head position and settled into his seat with the quiet patience of something that had been doing this exact thing for longer than most human nations had existed. He opened the second session and gave the human delegation their formal response window. Diane Cole stood up. She did not look nervous. She did not look angry. She looked like a woman who had been given a problem and had spent the night solving it, and was now simply here to show her work. "Members of the Assembly," she said, in clean, clear trade language, "we thank you for the opportunity to respond." She nodded to Danny Reeves, who activated the projection system from his station. A wide holographic display opened above the center floor of the chamber, visible to every delegate in every tier. Then Dr. Laura Finch walked to the floor. She was quiet and precise, and she wore the same gray field jacket she always wore, slightly wrinkled from 2 days of no sleep. She stood in the center of the chamber, under the holographic display, with a small data pad in her hands, and looked completely comfortable, the way people look when they know something important that no one else in the room has figured out yet. She began to speak. The first thing she displayed was the original galactic survey of the Kepler Fringe, conducted not by humans, but by the Iraqi Dominion itself, 400 years ago. The document was certified, sealed, and stamped with the Iraqi administrative mark. It listed every system in the Kepler Fringe as uninhabited, unmaintained, and unclaimed. Several Iraqi delegates shifted in their seats. Laura then pulled up Assembly Charter Article 7, specifically the subsection titled Settlement Rights in Uncertified Space. She read it aloud in the original language and then in the common trade tongue. The article was written to allow any member species to establish settlements in unclaimed space, provided the space had been surveyed and listed as uninhabited. If no claim was filed within a standard galactic cycle following survey completion, the space was considered open. No claim had ever been filed on the Kepler Fringe, not by the hegemony, not by anyone, for 400 years. Humanity did not break a rule, Laura said simply. We followed one. Specifically, the rule written into this charter by the Yavoran hegemon in the 1140th session of this very assembly. The chamber was very quiet. Danny moved through the data displays with practice speed. Colony population counts, infrastructure development timelines, resource extraction logs. Every number was sourced and certified. Every figure had an origin document attached. 31 years after joining the assembly, Earth had established 19 permanent settlements across the Kepler Fringe, built 3 orbital platforms, opened 2 research stations, and connected all of it with their own relay network. Most species took 200 years to build what humans had built in 3 decades. Laura did not say this in a proud tone. She said it the way you state a fact when someone questions whether the sun rises in the east. Delegate Doss of the Yavoran hegemony interrupted. His 4 arms moved in an agitated pattern, and his translator chip produced a sharp, clipped voice. He said that the charter article in question had been intended for uninhabited deep space regions, not corridors adjacent to established trade routes. Laura turned to him calmly. She asked him to point to the specific language in Article 7 that made that distinction. He did not point to it, because it wasn't there. She turned back to the chamber and continued. A second interruption came from a small bird-like delegate whose species name translated roughly as the Vel. They claimed that human mining operations in the Kepler Fringe had disturbed geological formations of historical significance. Danny immediately brought up the archaeological survey data. The formations in question had been surveyed and catalogued by Earth's own science teams before a single mining drill was placed. The actual excavation had taken place 600 kilometers from the nearest site of interest. The Vel delegate had no follow-up. A third interruption came from Delegate Vreth himself, who said in his slow, smooth voice that the assembly was not a courtroom, and that technical details, while noted, did not address the broader concern of stability in the galactic order. Diane stepped forward from her seat. Delegate Vreth, she said, with respect, the galactic order you are describing is one in which a newer member species may be stripped of legally established settlements because older member species find our speed inconvenient. We do not accept that definition of order. Vreth looked at her for a long moment. His amber eyes were unreadable. The chamber stayed quiet. Danny quietly pulled up one more set of data, one that had not been part of the original plan. Nathan had asked for it the previous night, after he stopped planning and started thinking about something different. It was a comparison of fleet tonnage across member species, updated with Earth's most recent registration submissions to the Assembly's Naval Registry. Earth's fleet was not the largest, not even close, by raw number of ships. But the tonnage, the size and class of vessels, was not what most species had been keeping track of. The third combined fleet alone, which was currently sitting in orbit on standby, represented more firepower than any single species contingent currently stationed in assembly-controlled space. Danny let the numbers sit in the air without comment. The chamber read them. Every delegate had eyes, or whatever they used to see, and every single one of them understood what they were looking at. Diane did not reference the fleet data. She did not point to it. She simply concluded her team's presentation by standing in the center of the floor, hands at her sides, and speaking in a calm and even voice. Humanity has been a member of this assembly for 31 years. In that time, we have paid our dues, followed your rules, expanded within the boundaries of your own charter, and asked for nothing except what every other member state receives. We have not threatened any species. We have not taken any world that belonged to anyone. We built our homes on empty ground under empty skies, and we built them well. She paused. We came to this assembly as partners, but we did not come as subordinates. The silence that followed that statement was the loudest thing Nathan had ever heard in a room full of noise. It lasted for several seconds. Then the delegates began talking among themselves, murmuring, clicking, humming, shuffling. The sound built slowly, like a wave gathering before it breaks. Nathan looked around the room. He saw the hegemony delegates conferring in tight, agitated clusters. He saw the smaller species, the Marathi, the Vel, a few others, watching the human delegation with expressions that were harder to read. Not hostile. Something else. Something closer to recalculation. Danny leaned over and whispered, "Did that work?" Nathan picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. Nathan had known since the first night that it would come to this. It didn't matter how well Laura had argued, or how cleanly Diane had taken apart every accusation. Politics in this galaxy worked the same way it worked back home. Whoever had the most allies when the count was taken, won. And the Yavoran hegemony had spent a very long time making allies. Senator Greg Lawson was watching from Earth through a quantum link feed. He was a broad-faced man in his late 50s, with gray at his temples, and the permanent expression of someone carrying a weight he had agreed to carry but was not entirely happy about. He sat in a secure room in the Senate building in Washington, with 2 aides beside him, staring at a feed that showed the conclave chamber from above. He hadn't slept much either. The session opened quietly. Delegate Vreth moved through the procedural steps in his usual unhurried way, reading the resolution into the formal record, confirming quorum, acknowledging all filed statements. Then he called for the vote. It went the way Nathan had expected. The first 12 species voted in favor of the resolution. Then the next 8. Then 4 more. Each vote was announced in the flat, neutral voice of the chamber's automated register, and each one landed in the room like a small stone dropped into still water. The hegemony delegation sat with the satisfied stillness of people watching a plan come together. A few species abstained. The Marathi Compact abstained. Delegate Siva, small, gray, sitting 3 rows up in the mid-tier section, looked down at the floor when her abstention was recorded, as if she didn't want to see the human delegation's reaction. She had wanted to vote differently. But wanting and doing were very different things when the hegemony controlled the trade routes your people depended on. The final count was 47 in favor, 9 abstentions, and 3 against. The three against were Earth's own vote, plus two small species from the outer reaches of the galaxy who had no trade connections with the hegemony and therefore nothing to lose. The resolution passed. It was formally entered into the Assembly's record. The human settlements in the Kepler Fringe were to be vacated within one galactic cycle. The trade embargo would begin within 72 standard hours. All human structures in the Kepler Fringe were to be surrendered or dismantled. The families living in those colonies, the miners, the farmers, the children born under alien skies, were to pack their things and leave. Back on Earth, Greg Lawson stared at the feed and said nothing for a long time. Then, under his breath, he said one short word that his aides pretended not to hear. In the chamber, Delegate Vreth opened the floor for final statements before the resolution was officially sealed. This was a formality. Nobody ever said anything during final statements. It was the moment after the door had already closed. A courtesy, nothing more. That was when Nathan stood up. Not Diane, Nathan. He was not the ambassador. He was the military attaché. His role in the delegation was advisory. He had no formal standing to address the assembly floor. But he stood up anyway, and the chamber went quiet. Because something in the way he moved, steady, deliberate, completely without hurry, made every delegate go still, without knowing quite why. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point at anyone. He spoke in a flat, even tone that carried across the chamber without effort. He said that the Earth delegation did not recognize the legitimacy of a vote that had been manufactured through years of political coercion. He said that the Kepler Fringe colonies were home to 411,000 human civilians, men and women and children who had built those homes with their own hands, on ground no one had touched in 400 years. He said that no resolution passed in this chamber would move a single one of them. Then he said something that made the room go completely cold. He said that Fleet Admiral Aaron Cross, currently commanding Earth's 3rd Combined Fleet in orbit above Verath Prime, had standing orders in the event that any armed force attempted to enter the Kepler Fringe with the intention of enforcing removal of human civilians. He did not say what those orders were. He did not need to. The hegemony's representative, Doss, spoke immediately. He said the statement was a threat. He said it was a violation of assembly conduct rules. He said it proved that humanity was exactly the kind of unstable, aggressive species the resolution was designed to protect the galaxy from. Nathan looked at him for a moment. Just looked. Then he said, "It's a statement of fact. Whether those orders become relevant depends entirely on what happens next." He sat back down. The chamber erupted. 20 delegates trying to speak at once, their translators all firing in overlapping bursts of sound. Vreth called for order. It took a full 3 minutes for the noise to settle. Danny Reeves sat rigid in his seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. Laura Finch had her hands flat on the table in front of her, very still. She was watching Diane. Diane had not moved during Nathan's statement. She had sat with perfect composure, watching the chamber. Now she looked down at the table in front of her. On it sat the official ceremonial copy of the resolution, a physical document, printed on pale galactic parchment in the Assembly's tradition, stamped and sealed and ribbon-bound. A symbol of finality. 4,000 years of protocol wrapped in a single piece of paper. She picked it up. She turned it face down on the table. Then she stood up, smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, and walked toward the exit. Nathan rose from his seat without a word and followed her. Then Danny, then Laura, then every member of the human delegation, 12 people in total, all rising from their chairs in the outer ring of the Galactic Assembly and walking out of the chamber in a single, quiet line. Nobody stopped them. Nobody spoke. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound. In the chamber, the silence lasted for a long time. Delegate Vreth sat very still, his amber eyes moving slowly across the room. The hegemony delegation conferred in urgent whispers. Delegate Siva of the Marathi Compact stared at the door the humans had walked through and did not look away. In Washington, Greg Lawson watched the feed of an empty set of chairs in the outer ring and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not pride exactly. Something bigger than pride, and harder to name. He turned to one of his aides and said quietly, "Get me a line to Admiral Cross." The aide moved quickly. Outside the Conclave Station, in the cold dark of space above Varath Prime, the running lights of the Third Combined Fleet held steady in orbit, patient, unmoving, waiting. The galaxy had watched the humans walk out. Now it had to decide what to do next. And for the first time in a very long time, it was not sure. That was the thing about the Quantum Relay Network, a network that the hegemony controlled and had once used to strangle the flow of information to species it didn't like. But humans had a habit of building their own things when other people's things were inconvenient. And the journalist Kyle Barrow had been broadcasting from the Conclave Station on Earth's independent relay since before the first session began. Kyle was 29, rail-thin, with the permanently tired eyes of someone who had been running on adrenaline and ration bars for 3 days. He had a small camera drone that he'd named Gerald, and Gerald had been in that chamber for every session, hovering near the ceiling in the press gallery, recording everything. The footage of Nathan's statement went out to every human world inside 4 minutes of the walkout. The footage of Diane turning the resolution face down and walking out went out 30 seconds after that. Within 2 hours, it had been picked up by 43 independent alien relay stations operated by species who had no official connection to the hegemony's network. Within 6 hours, it had been broadcast across most of the inhabited galaxy. Some species watched it with alarm. Some watched it with confusion. A few watched it over and over again, in silence, the way you watch something you are trying very hard to understand. The hegemony's reaction was exactly what you would expect from a group of powerful people who had just had their authority ignored in front of the entire galaxy. They were furious. Emergency meetings were called. Formal complaints were filed with the Assembly Secretariat, which was a bit like filing a complaint about a fire while the fire was still burning. Military advisors were summoned. Enforcement options were discussed. That was when the meetings got quieter. The hegemony's chief military advisor was a creature named Vosh, old, careful, with a long record of honest assessments that had not always been welcomed by his superiors. He sat in the hegemony's private session room and presented his briefing with the same flat professionalism he brought to everything. And when he was done, the room was very still. What Vosh had laid out was simple. The Third Combined Fleet, currently in orbit above Varath Prime, was not Earth's largest fleet. It wasn't even Earth's second largest. It was the standing deployment fleet, the one kept on active rotation at all times, the one that could be moved on short notice without drawing down Earth's home defense. Earth had 5 of them. The hegemony had done what most older galactic powers did. They had maintained enough of a military presence to discourage small-scale disputes, and spent the rest of their resources on economic and political control. It had worked perfectly well for 1,200 years. The problem was that it worked best against species who thought the same way. Humans did not think the same way. At some point in the last 3 decades, and the hegemony's intelligence division was embarrassed to admit they were not sure exactly when, humanity had made a quiet collective decision. It came, apparently, from their own history. Humans had a very long and very unpleasant record of what happened to people who were unable to defend themselves. And they had decided, with the calm stubbornness their species was apparently famous for at home, that they were never going to be those people again. They had built accordingly. Nobody in the room spoke for almost a full minute. Then the hegemony's senior delegate said that they would pursue diplomatic channels. Vosh nodded and did not say what he was thinking. On Kepler-7, a planet that smelled like pine resin and cold iron, Mara Holt was watching the news feeds on a screen mounted to the wall of the colony's main operations building. She was the settlement's administrator, 34 years old, practical, calm in the way that people who spent their lives managing things in difficult places tended to be calm. She had grown up hearing stories about the first settlers who came to the fringe. Her mother had been one of them. She watched the footage of the walkout 3 times. Then she turned it off and went back to work, because the water recyclers in the Eastern Quadrant had been throwing an error code since midnight, and someone had to deal with it. 2 hours later, Kyle Barrow's drone was transmitting a new feed, this one from a different angle. An Iraqi diplomatic shuttle had appeared in Kepler-7's orbital space and was requesting permission to land near the colony perimeter. Not a military ship, a diplomatic vessel, a small one. Mara heard the landing request come through the communication terminal. She looked at her deputy, a quiet older man named Frank, who had been on this planet for 15 years, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone who wanted to know what she was going to do. She picked up her jacket off the back of her chair. "I'll handle it," she said. She walked out of the operations building alone, across the open ground of the colony perimeter, hard brown soil, thin grass, the distant shapes of the colony structures behind her, and stood at the edge of the landing pad with her hands in her pockets, and waited. The shuttle came down in a cloud of dust. The door opened. 3 Iraqi officials in formal robes stepped out, and they stopped when they saw her standing there alone. No guards, no security, no weapons visible. Just one human woman in a work jacket, standing in the dust with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. Kyle's drone caught it all. The image went out on every relay within minutes. One human woman, standing alone on a cold alien world that she had helped build, waiting for whoever wanted to talk. It became, within hours, the most shared image in the Human Information Network. Greg Lawson saw it on his screen in Washington and had to stand up and walk to the window for a moment. On the conclave station, the human delegation had not returned to the assembly chamber. They were in their quarters, and Diane was receiving a quiet but very steady stream of private communication requests from delegations who had publicly voted against them. Not from the hegemony, from the smaller species, the ones who had abstained, the ones who had voted yes because they were afraid. None of them wanted to be on record. None of them would send an official message through the registered assembly channels. But they were reaching out through back channels, through intermediaries, through the kind of quiet, sideways communication that happens when powerful people have shifted and smaller people are trying to figure out which way to lean. Nathan sat in the corner of the room and watched Diane read through the messages. He already knew roughly what they said. He pulled up a map of the Kepler fringe on his screen and looked at it for a while. 12 colony worlds, each one named by the people who had built it. Simple names, most of them. Names that meant something to the people who lived there. Names that meant nothing to the delegates in that chamber. Greg Lawson's authorization came through an hour later. 3 additional fleet groups, the 1st, the 4th, and the 7th combined, were beginning their movement toward the Kepler fringe. Not at combat speed, not quietly either. They were moving at normal transit speed on logged routes, registered with the Assembly's naval tracking system, fully visible to anyone paying attention. The message was not spoken anywhere in official record, but it was received by every military advisor in every hegemony session room without a single word needing to be said. Danny looked at the fleet movement data on his screen. "Is this going to work?" he asked. Nathan thought about Mara Holt standing in the dust outside her colony, hands in her pockets, waiting without fear for whoever came next. "It's already working," he said. They were not quiet weeks. They were the kind of weeks where nothing officially happened, but everything actually did. Where messages were sent and not replied to. Where meetings were held in rooms with no official record. Where powerful people sat in private and tried to calculate the cost of being wrong. The hegemony had not moved against the Kepler Fringe. They had not sent enforcement ships. They had not pushed the embargo into full effect. They had announced it, threatened it, and then very quietly done nothing, while their military advisors sat in rooms and looked at fleet tonnage numbers, and chose their words very carefully. The two more aggressive member species of the hegemony bloc had issued 3 separate strongly worded statements. The other 2 member species had stopped issuing statements entirely. Private reports suggested that there were serious disagreements happening inside the hegemony's internal council. Disagreements that had apparently been there for years, held together by the assumption that things would always go their way. That assumption was now cracked. The reconvening request came from 14 species simultaneously, submitted through the Assembly Secretariat in a coordinated filing that had clearly taken some time to organize. None of the 14 were hegemony members. Most of them were mid-tier species, modest fleets, modest economies, the kind of worlds that had survived for centuries by staying carefully neutral. They were not neutral now. They wanted a resolution, a real one, before something happened that could not be undone. The session was set for the morning of the 15th day. Nathan was up before the light cycle turned white. He sat at the small table in the delegation quarters, with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and looked out through the single narrow viewport at the stars. The running lights of the 3rd Combined Fleet were not visible from this angle, but he knew they were there. He knew where all of them were. He had the fleet positions memorized, the way other people memorize the names of family members. Diane came out from her room, already dressed and ready. She poured herself a cup of something hot from the station dispenser, made a face at the taste, and sat down across from him. "How do you want to play it today?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Like we always planned to play it," she said. "We walk in and we finish it." He nodded. They arrived at the chamber early. The human delegation filed in without announcement, without ceremony. But they did not return to the outer ring. They walked to the central table, the main floor table, the one reserved for the senior delegating bodies, the one Earth had never been offered a seat at, and they sat down. No one had told them they could sit there. No one had invited them. No rules specifically prohibited it either, though the precedent was clear enough that several delegates who arrived after them stopped in the doorway and stared before finding their seats. Delegate Vreth arrived and looked at the human delegation sitting at the central table. His amber eyes moved over them slowly. He said nothing. He took his own seat. The session opened. The 14 co-sponsoring species each gave brief statements of concern, calling for a negotiated resolution in the interest of galactic stability. They were measured and careful in their language, but the meaning underneath was clear. They were tired of being caught between large powers and wanted a framework that protected smaller members. Then Diane Cole stood up at the central table. She did not spend time on grievances. She did not reference the vote. She did not mention the walkout, or the fleet movements, or any of the events of the past 2 weeks. She simply presented a framework. It was built on Assembly Charter Article 7, the same article that established humanity's legal right to the Kepler Fringe settlements. The framework formalized that right, permanently and without conditions. It also established a set of mutual non-interference boundaries across the fringe corridor that applied equally to all species, including the hegemony. No one could claim territory that had been continuously settled for more than 5 standard years without the consent of its inhabitants. The rule applied to everyone. Then she presented the second part. Earth was proposing the opening of a new independent trade corridor through the Kepler Fringe, maintained by Earth, and open to all assembly members on equal terms. The corridor bypassed two major hegemony relay points that had been used for years to quietly inflate transit costs for smaller species. Under Earth's terms, every species in the assembly would have access to the same rate. That second part landed in the chamber differently than anything else that had been said in 3 days of sessions. Several delegates sat up straighter. Others began talking quietly among themselves. The 14 co-sponsoring species, who had come expecting a tense negotiation, looked at each other with the carefully contained expression of people who had just been offered something better than they came for. Two of the hegemony's member species requested a recess to confer with their councils. It was granted. When the session resumed 40 minutes later, those two species indicated willingness to accept the framework with minor clarifications. The other two hegemony members issued a formal objection, and then when the chamber moved to vote anyway, requested their objection be placed on record, which was the political language for, "We disagree, but we are not going to fight about it." The vote was called. It passed. Not unanimously. The two objecting hegemony species held their no votes, which were entered into the record and would mean very little in practice. But 39 species voted in favor. 3 voted no. The framework was entered into the Assembly's formal record and sealed. Diane sat down. She did not smile. She folded her hands on the table and waited for the session to close, the way a person waits after a long job of work is finished, not with celebration, but with the quiet satisfaction of something done properly. Danny exhaled loudly enough that Laura gave him a small sharp look. He mouthed the word, "sorry," and went back to staring at his screen. Nathan said nothing. He was watching the chamber. As the session ended and delegates began to rise and move, Delegate Siva of the Marathi Compact made her way down from the mid-tier seating to the floor. She was small and gray, and moved carefully, and she stopped beside Diane with the hesitant manner of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say and was now not sure how to begin. "Ambassador Cole," she said. Her translated voice was quiet and a little rough. "If I may ask, were you certain, when you walked out 2 weeks ago, when Colonel Hale made his statement, did you know this is how it would end?" Diane looked at her for a moment. The question was an honest one, and it deserved an honest answer. "No," Diane said. "We weren't certain. We're not very often certain." Siva looked at her steadily. "Then how did you do it?" Diane thought about that, about Mara Holt standing alone on Kepler 7 in the dust, about Nathan sitting in the dark the first night planning instead of worrying, about Laura not sleeping for 2 days because the data had to be right, about 12 people walking out of a chamber in a single quiet line because it was the only thing left to do. "We've never let not being certain stop us before," she said. Siva was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, slowly, and turned and walked away. The chamber emptied gradually. The lights stayed their steady pale white. Somewhere in the corridors outside, Kyle Barrow was already recording his final broadcast of the session, talking into his camera in the fast, careful way he had. Not dramatic, just clear and accurate, which was how he always worked. Nathan was the last of the delegation to leave the chamber. He stopped at the door and turned back for one moment, looking at the empty room, the tiered seats, the pale stone floor, the space where the resolution had been read aloud 3 days ago, and turned face down on a table. Then he walked out. Outside the station's hull, in the dark above Verath Prime, the third combined fleet sat in orbit, with its running lights on, steady, patient, holding position the way they had held it for 2 weeks, not advancing, not retreating, just there. Admiral Aaron Cross received the confirmation code from Diane's office at 0740 station time. He read it once, set it down, and told his navigation officer to begin the transit home. The fleet turned slowly in the dark, a long line of lights, shifting direction with the unhurried confidence of ships that had nothing left to prove. They moved toward the Kepler fringe, toward the colonies and the people in them. toward the worlds built on empty ground, under alien skies, by people who had decided a long time ago that the galaxy did not get to decide what happened to them. The stars did not move. They never did. But the galaxy, watching those ships go, felt something it had not felt in a very long time. It felt like the rules had changed. And somewhere on a cold brown world that smelled like pine resin and iron, Mara Holt stood outside the operations building and watched the sky clear up after a night of cloud cover. And the stars came out one by one, and she stood there with her hands in her pockets for a long time, looking up. She wasn't afraid of any of it.